The morning of April 5, 1815, began like any other on the island of Sumbawa in the Indonesian archipelago. Fishermen along the northern coast prepared their nets, farmers tended to their rice paddies, and the children of the village of Tambora played beneath the shadow of the great mountain that bore their village's name. Mount Tambora had stood silent for centuries, its peak soaring more than 14,000 feet into the tropical sky, making it one of the tallest mountains in all the Dutch East Indies. The people who lived in its shadow had no memory of the mountain ever causing them harm. They had no reason to fear it. Then, just before sunset, the earth began to shake. A massive explosion ripped through the evening calm, sending a plume of ash 18 miles into the darkening sky. For 2 hours, streams of lava erupted from Mount Tambora's peak while the people of Sumbawa fled in terror from their homes. More than 800 miles away, in Buitenzorg on the island of Java, Thomas Stamford Raffles, the lieutenant governor of Java under British occupation, heard the distant rumble and assumed it was cannon fire. British authorities across the region made the same mistake. The commander of the city of Yogyakarta, in central Java, dispatched troops to search for invaders. Officials along the coast interpreted the thunderous sounds as signals from a ship in distress and launched rescue boats into the darkening waters. They found nothing. For the next 5 days, the explosions continued intermittently. Volcanic ash began falling on eastern Java, coating everything in a fine gray powder. A strange fog drifted across the islands, dimming the sunlight and leaving an acrid taste in the air. And then, on the evening of April 10, 1815, Mount Tambora unleashed the full fury of what would become the most powerful volcanic eruption in recorded human history. 3 columns of fire shot from the mountain's summit, meeting briefly at their peak in what one eyewitness described as a troubled and confused manner. Within moments, the entire mountain appeared to be consumed by liquid fire, a fountain of ash, water, and molten rock shooting in every direction. The explosion was heard more than 1,200 miles away in Sumatra. Sailors aboard the British ship Benares, anchored at Makassar some 240 miles northeast of Tambora, reported what sounded like a firing of cannon that seemed to approach ever nearer. The violence of that night defied comprehension. Incandescent avalanches of superheated gas, rock, and ash pyroclastic flows raced down the mountain's flanks at speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour, destroying everything in their path. The flows reached the sea, boiling into the water and generating tsunamis 15 feet high that crashed against the coastlines of surrounding islands. The village of Tambora vanished beneath a flood of pumice and ash. The nearby settlement of Sanggar was leveled by winds generated by the rapidly rising air above the eruption column. The ash fall was catastrophic. Within a radius of 100 miles, ash accumulated to depths of 12 feet or more, collapsing roofs and burying entire villages. At distances of 300 miles, the ash was still several inches deep. Ships attempting to navigate the surrounding waters found themselves plowing through floating rafts of pumice stone, some stretching 3 miles across. The British ships Fairlie and James Sibbald would encounter these floating fields of debris more than 2,000 miles west of Tambora in October 1815, half a year after the eruption. But it was not the immediate destruction that would make Mount Tambora's eruption the most consequential volcanic event in human history. It was what happened next, what rose invisibly into the upper atmosphere and spread across the entire planet, that would reshape the world. The explosion of April 10 to 11, 1815, ejected between 37 and 45 cubic miles of rock, ash, and debris into the atmosphere. Mount Tambora lost more than 4,000 feet of its height in a single night, collapsing into a caldera nearly 4 miles wide and more than half a mile deep. But the most significant material was invisible to the naked eye. Approximately 60 million tons of sulfur dioxide gas propelled more than 25 miles into the stratosphere. There, in the upper reaches of the atmosphere, this sulfur dioxide combined with water vapor to form sulfuric acid. The acid condensed into billions upon billions of microscopic droplets, each one 200 times finer than the width of a human hair. These droplets were light enough to remain suspended in the atmosphere for years, drifting on high-altitude winds that carried them around the entire globe. They formed an aerosol veil that would wrap the Earth in a shroud of volcanic haze. The people of 1815 had no understanding of atmospheric chemistry. They could not know that this invisible veil would block incoming solar radiation and absorb heat, cooling the surface of the planet while warming the stratosphere above. They could not predict that the effects would not be felt immediately, but would build gradually as the aerosol cloud spread across the northern hemisphere. They could not imagine that the following year, 1816, would become known to history as the year without a summer. Thomas Stamford Raffles was a curious man by nature. As president of the Batavian Society, dedicated to the study of Java's natural history, he had spent years documenting the geology, flora, and fauna of the Indonesian islands. When reports of the devastation on Sumbawa reached him, he immediately dispatched Lieutenant Owen Phillips with emergency supplies of rice and instructions to investigate what had occurred. What Phillips found when he arrived several weeks after the eruption haunted him for the rest of his life. The island was devastated beyond recognition. Every tree had been stripped bare or uprooted entirely. Villages lay in ruins, buried under feet of ash and pumice. Dead bodies littered the roadsides, some victims of the initial eruption, others who had perished from starvation or disease in the chaotic weeks that followed. The survivors Phillips encountered were skeletal, desperate, fighting over scraps of food. The extreme misery to which the inhabitants have been reduced is shocking to behold, Phillips wrote in his report to Raffles. There were still on the roadside the remains of several corpses, and the marks of where many others had been interred, the villages almost entirely deserted and the houses fallen down. An epidemic of violent dysentery had broken out, caused by volcanic ash contaminating the drinking water. The same deadly ash had poisoned the rice paddies, destroying the crops that the survivors depended upon. Horses and cattle perished by the hundreds for lack of forage. Phillips distributed what rice he could, but it was nowhere near enough. The suffering on Sumbawa and the neighboring island of Lombok would continue for months. Conservative estimates suggest that at least 10,000 people died in the immediate violence of the eruption, from the pyroclastic flows, the tsunamis, and the collapsing buildings. But that was only the beginning. Over the following months, tens of thousands more perished from starvation and disease. The Swiss botanist Heinrich Zollinger, who traveled to Sumbawa in 1847 and collected eyewitness accounts of the disaster, estimated that more than 48,000 people died on Sumbawa alone, with another 44,000 on Lombok. More recent scholarly estimates by Clive Oppenheimer and others suggest a total death toll of at least 71,000 in Indonesia, with some calculations reaching as high as 100,000. Yet even this staggering toll would be dwarfed by what was to come. The invisible cloud of sulfuric acid that had spread across the stratosphere was about to announce its presence to the world. The spring of 1816 arrived in New England with familiar promise. Farmers in Vermont, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine prepared their fields for planting, anticipating the cycle of growth and harvest that had sustained their families for generations. The winter had been harsh but not unusually so. There was no reason to expect that the coming growing season would be anything other than ordinary. But something was wrong. The sun seemed dimmer than usual, its light filtered through a persistent haze that no one could explain. In the northeastern United States, this strange dry fog had been observed since the previous summer, reddening and dimming the sunlight so dramatically that observers could see sunspots with the naked eye. Neither wind nor rainfall seemed to disperse it. Scientists of the era had no explanation for the phenomenon. On April 24, 1816, temperatures in Salem, Massachusetts reached a pleasant 74 degrees. But, within 30 hours, the mercury had plummeted to 21 degrees. This wild oscillation between warmth and bitter cold would become the defining characteristic of the months ahead. May brought frost that killed crops throughout the higher elevations of the New England states. Farmers replanted, hoping for better weather. It did not come. On June 5, a heatwave pushed temperatures in Ipswich, Massachusetts to 92 degrees. By the next morning, it was 43 degrees and falling. For the next 4 days, severe frosts gripped the eastern seaboard, and, in many locations, snow began to fall. Snow. In June. On June 6, 1816, 6 inches of snow fell across New England. The clockmaker Chauncey Jerome would later write in his autobiography that he walked to work that day in Plymouth, Connecticut, wearing heavy woolen clothes, an overcoat, and mittens on what should have been a warm early summer morning. In Albany, New York, snow accumulated on the ground. In Dennisville, Maine, the snowfall was heavy enough to disrupt daily life. In Cape May, New Jersey, frost was reported 5 nights in a row, devastating crops that had only just begun to grow. But nowhere was the cold more devastating than in Vermont. Benjamin Harwood, a farmer in Bennington, recorded the horror in his diary. "It rained all night then, began to snow from 8 a.m. to 2 p.m., he wrote on June 8. The heads of all the mountains on every side were crowned with snow. The most gloomy and extraordinary weather ever seen." In Cabot, Vermont, the snow lay 18 inches deep on June 8, deep enough to make travel nearly impossible. Nicholas Bennett, a member of the Shaker community near New Lebanon, New York, wrote that all was froze and the hills were barren like winter. The ground froze solid on June 9, and the Shakers had to replant their crops 3 days later. But the replanting was futile. On July 7, it was so cold that everything stopped growing. Near Randolph, Vermont, a farmer went out to tend his sheep during the June storm and never returned. Search parties found his body 3 days later, frozen to death. His nephew, James Winchester, later recounted the man's last words to his wife: "If I am not back in an hour, call the neighbors and start them after me." June is a bad month to get buried in the snow, especially when it gets so near July. Throughout New England, the pattern repeated itself with cruel persistence. Brief periods of warmth raised hopes that the crisis had passed, only for killing frosts to destroy whatever crops had managed to survive. The temperature swings were dramatic and unprecedented. Farmers reported drops of 30 degrees within a matter of hours. Ice remained on rivers and lakes in northwestern Pennsylvania until August. Frost was reported in Virginia as late as August 20. Edward Holyoke, a Salem physician and amateur astronomer, was in Franconia, New Hampshire on June 7. "Exceedingly cold," he wrote. "Ground frozen hard, and squalls of snow through the day. Icicles 12 inches long in the shade of noonday." The corn crop, upon which so many New England families depended, was devastated. What corn managed to grow never ripened properly. No more than a quarter of it was usable for food, and much of what remained was moldy and unfit even for animal feed. The price of oats rose from 12 cents per bushel in 1815 to 92 cents per bushel in 1816, an eightfold increase that put basic foodstuffs beyond the reach of many families. Sarah Snell Bryant of Cummington, Massachusetts, captured the bewilderment of that summer in 2 simple words she wrote in her diary: "Weather backward." The people of 1816 searched desperately for explanations. Some blamed the positions of the planets. Others pointed to the distance between the Earth and the Moon, or to the unusual scarcity of sunspots that astronomers had observed. A few speculated that massive icebergs in the North Atlantic were somehow responsible for the cold. The Reverend Thomas Robbins of East Windsor, Connecticut, kept a detailed diary of the disaster, recording reports of a man in Maine freezing to death and of a foot of snow in the Berkshires in June. No one connected the suffering in New England to the volcanic eruption that had occurred on the other side of the world a year earlier. How could they? The Dutch East Indies were half a world away, and the concept of a volcanic event affecting global climate was not yet understood. It would not be until the 1883 eruption of Krakatoa, another Indonesian volcano, that scientists would begin to understand the connection between large volcanic eruptions and worldwide weather patterns. But the effects were undeniable, even if the cause remained mysterious. Thomas Jefferson, the former President of the United States, maintained detailed weather records at his home in Monticello, Virginia. On May 17, 1816, he wrote, "The spring has been unusually dry and cold. Our average morning cold for the month of May in other years has been 63 degrees of Fahrenheit. In the present month it has been to this day an average of 53 degrees and one morning as low as 43 degrees. Repeated frosts have killed the early fruits and the crops of tobacco and wheat will be poor." In September, Jefferson wrote again to his friend Albert Gallatin, attempting to make sense of what had happened: "We have had the most extraordinary year of drought and cold ever known in the history of America. In June, instead of 3 3/4 inches, our average of rain for that month, we had only 1/3 of an inch. In August, instead of 9 1/6 inches, our average, we had only 8/10 of an inch. And it still continues. The summer too has been as cold as a moderate winter. In every state north of this there has been frost in every month of the year. In this state we had none in June and July. But those of August killed much corn over the mountains. The crop of corn through the Atlantic states will probably be less than 1/3 of an ordinary one, that of tobacco still less, and of mean quality. Jefferson, one of the most scientifically curious minds of his generation, could not connect the dots between cause and effect. He had surely heard of the Tambora eruption. News had reached the Western world by then, but the idea that a volcano in Indonesia could cause snow in Vermont was simply beyond the scientific understanding of the time. The crisis in New England had profound consequences that would reshape American history. Thousands of families, despairing of ever making a living from the frozen soil of the Northeast, made the decision to abandon their farms and seek better fortune in the West. In Ashland, New Hampshire, a farmer named Reuben Whitten managed to grow wheat on his south-facing farm despite the terrible conditions. He shared his harvest with his starving neighbors, an act of generosity that was remembered long after his death in 1847. His neighbors paid for his gravestone and later erected a monument that read, "A pioneer of this town." Cold season of 1816 raised 40 bushels of wheat on this land, which kept his family and neighbors from starvation. But most were not so fortunate. The historian L.D. Stillwell estimated that Vermont alone lost between 10,000 and 15,000 people to emigration in 1816 and 1817, erasing 7 years of population growth in a matter of months. Families packed their belongings onto wagons and headed west to Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, seeking land where they could grow food without fear of summer frost. Among those who left Vermont was the Smith family of Norwich. Joseph Smith Sr. and his wife Lucy, along with their children, relocated to Palmyra, New York, in the aftermath of the year without a summer. Their son, Joseph Smith Jr., would later found the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It is impossible to say whether this religious movement would have developed as it did had the Smith family remained in Vermont, but the exodus triggered by Tambora's eruption played a role in shaping the religious landscape of 19th-century America. Indiana became a state in December 1816, Illinois followed 2 years later. The rapid population growth that made statehood possible was driven in part by the refugees of the year without a summer, fleeing the cold and crop failures of the Northeast for what they hoped would be more hospitable lands. If New England suffered terribly, Europe suffered worse. The continent was already reeling from 20 years of nearly continuous warfare. The Napoleonic Wars had devastated economies, disrupted trade, and killed millions. The Battle of Waterloo, fought on June 18, 1815, just 2 months after Tambora's eruption, had finally ended the conflict, but Europe was in no condition to withstand another catastrophe. The summer of 1816 brought cold and rain of unprecedented severity. In Switzerland, temperatures plummeted so dramatically that the summer felt like winter. The snowline on the Alps descended far below its normal level, and glaciers began advancing, a phenomenon that would not be fully understood until the Swiss engineer Ignaz van Etz began studying the relationship between climate and glacial movement in the years that followed. The rain was relentless. In Geneva, precipitation in summer 1816 was 80% higher than normal. The constant dampness rotted crops in the fields before they could be harvested. What grain survived the rain succumbed to the cold. In Germany, France, and Poland, unusually heavy snowfalls buried whatever hope farmers had of salvaging their harvests. The effect on food prices was immediate and devastating. Grain that had sold for reasonable prices in 1815 suddenly became precious beyond measure. Bread, the staple of the European diet, became a luxury that many could not afford. With the cause of the disaster unknown, desperate people directed their anger at the most visible targets, the grain markets and bakeries where food was bought and sold. Food riots erupted across the continent. Hungry mobs stormed warehouses and demanded that governments do anything, to end their suffering. The violence of 1816 and 1817 was the most intense Europe had experienced since the French Revolution a generation earlier. In Britain and France, arson and looting became common as social order began to break down. Switzerland was hit particularly hard. Landlocked and mountainous, the country had always been vulnerable to crop failures, but the scale of the disaster in 1816 was unprecedented. Famine was especially severe in the densely populated eastern cantons, where industry had drawn workers away from subsistence farming and created a population dependent on food that could no longer be grown. The Swiss government declared a national emergency, one of the first such declarations in modern European history. In the summer of 1816, a wealthy Russian baroness named Julienne de Krudner arrived at the small town of Arau in Switzerland. A religious mystic who had gained influence in the court of Tsar Alexander I, the baroness had come to Switzerland seeking spiritual enlightenment. What she found instead was a humanitarian catastrophe. Refugees were streaming into Switzerland from the surrounding regions, Germany, France, Italy, all fleeing the famine that had gripped their homelands. These desperate people, many of them families with small children, had nothing. They had lost their crops, sold their possessions, and now wandered the roads in search of food and shelter. The citizens of Switzerland looked upon them with a mixture of pity and fear that the growing population of refugees would drive food prices even higher and drag everyone down into starvation. The Baroness de Krudner was horrified by what she witnessed. "If you only knew how my life is," she wrote to a friend. "The hundreds of suffering, miserable beings who cling to me, misery, misfortune, despair in 1,000 forms, in a land of ruin and desolation." She sold her jewels and her fine clothes, relics of her former life as a salon belle, and used the proceeds to feed the poor. 30,000 francs, then more. At the height of the crisis, she was feeding 4,000 people a day. Pale, emaciated children and exhausted mothers passed beneath her windows, some so bereft of clothing that they could barely preserve their modesty. Local authorities were not pleased. The Baroness's charity, they argued, was drawing more refugees to the region, driving up food prices and straining resources. They ordered her to stop. Her response was defiant: "Judge for yourself, ask yourself if in this desolate time, when thousands wander from place to place without work or food, when mothers exhausted by hunger and sorrow come to me, laying their pitiable children at my feet, and confess their temptation, in the depths of their despair, to drown them in the Rhine, ask yourself, should I refuse them shelter? When the Rhine is clogged with corpses, the Black Forest echoes with the cries of the needy, and the cantons of Switzerland are ravaged by famine, I need only appeal to the tribunal of the Lord, whose authority is far greater than yours." By the spring of 1817, the Baroness de Krudner had spent 120,000 francs feeding an estimated 25,000 refugees, climate victims who would otherwise have perished from hunger and cold. She was one of the few who recognized the crisis for what it was: a disaster on a scale that required organized humanitarian response. The suffering did not end with the famine. Disease followed hunger, as it always does. Between 1816 and 1819, a massive typhus epidemic swept across Europe, killing tens of thousands. The disease spread rapidly among the malnourished and displaced populations that crowded into cities and refugee camps. Ireland, Italy, Switzerland, and Scotland were particularly hard hit. In Ireland, where the wheat, oat, and potato harvests had all failed, more than 44,000 people died from typhus and related famine diseases. But the deadliest consequence of Tambura's eruption was not typhus. It was cholera. The enormous cloud of sulfuric acid that Tambura had ejected into the stratosphere did more than cool the Earth's surface. It disrupted the planet's weather patterns in complex ways that scientists would not fully understand for nearly 2 centuries. One of the most significant of these disruptions occurred in the Bay of Bengal, off the coast of India. The Indian monsoon is the largest and most powerful weather system on Earth. Every year, warm, moisture-laden winds sweep in from the ocean, bringing the rains that sustain hundreds of millions of people. The monsoon's timing and intensity are crucial: too early or too late, too much rain or too little, and crops fail, people starve, and societies collapse. In 1816 and 1817, the monsoon failed. Tambura's aerosol veil had weakened the temperature differential between land and sea that drives the monsoon winds. The rains that should have come in June did not arrive until September. The result was first drought, then catastrophic flooding when the delayed monsoon finally broke. These wild swings in weather altered the ecology of the Bay of Bengal in ways that would have global consequences. Cholera had been endemic to the Bengal region for centuries, a seasonal disease that appeared during the winter months and caused localized outbreaks. But the bizarre conditions of 1816 and 1817 changed everything. The cholera bacterium, which is unusually sensitive to environmental conditions, mutated into a new and far more virulent strain. This new strain of cholera met with no natural resistance in the human population. Beginning in 1817, it began to spread, first through India, then, along trade routes to Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and, eventually the entire world. By century's end, the Bengal cholera pandemic had killed tens of millions of people. It would reshape medical science, spur the development of public health institutions, and transform urban planning in cities from London to New York. Just as the Black Death had defined the 14th century, cholera would define the 19th, and it all began with the disruption of the Indian monsoon by a volcanic eruption thousands of miles away. China suffered as well, though its story is less well known in the Western world. The worst affected region was Yunnan, a mountainous province in the southwest of the country. Yunnan had long been known as the land of eternal spring for its pleasant climate and abundant harvests. The eruption of Tambora changed all that. Beginning in the summer of 1815, just weeks after the eruption, Yunnan experienced record low temperatures that would persist for 3 years. The warm southerly monsoon winds that normally brought favorable weather were weakened by Tambora's atmospheric effects, allowing cold air from Mongolia to sweep south across China. Snow fell in summer. Frost killed crops that had been carefully tended for months. Rice, the staple food of southern China, is a remarkably hardy plant. It can survive flooding, drought, and a wide range of temperatures. But it cannot survive prolonged cold during the growing season, and this was precisely the condition that Tambora created. The rice crop failed completely. In some areas, production fell by as much as 2/3. A poet named Li Yuyan documented the horror of the Yunnan famine in a series of verses that became known as the Poetry of the Seven Sorrows, a revival of an ancient Chinese poetic form traditionally used to describe injustice and tragedy through the senses. His early poems described the environmental catastrophe: clouds like dragon's breath on the mountains, endless rain drowning the fields, cold winds that made summer feel like winter. But, as the famine deepened, Li Yuyan's poetry grew darker. He wrote of police beating back hungry crowds begging for food. He wrote of houses collapsing under the weight of unceasing rain. He wrote of parents selling their children in the markets. The grain reserves that the Qing dynasty maintained for times of famine were designed to cope with a single bad harvest. No one had planned for 3 consecutive years of crop failure. By the second year, there was almost no help to be had. The government system that was supposed to protect the people had been exposed as inadequate to the scale of the disaster. People ate white clay and soil to fill their empty stomachs, eventually dying from the intestinal damage this caused. Mothers, driven to the depths of despair, drowned their children rather than watch them slowly starve. Li Yuyan recorded it all, bearing witness to the suffering of his people. The famine finally ended in 1818, when normal weather returned and brought a bumper harvest. But the surviving farmers of Yunnan had been changed by the experience. Many decided that a cash crop was preferable to subsistence rice farming, something that could be sold for money that would protect them against future disasters. The crop they chose was the opium poppy. Within a few decades, opium was being grown across Yunnan. The farming techniques and processing knowledge developed there drifted south into the remote mountains of Burma, Laos, and Thailand. The Golden Triangle of international opium production, the source of much of the world's heroin to this day, can trace its origins to the desperate decisions of Chinese farmers in the aftermath of Mount Tambora's eruption. Yet amid all the suffering, something extraordinary was being created. In June 1816, a small group of English travelers gathered at the Villa Diodati, a stately mansion overlooking Lake Geneva in Switzerland. They had come seeking a pleasant summer holiday. What they found instead was cold, rain, and darkness, the same weather that was causing famine and death across Europe. Lord Byron, the most famous poet of his age, had rented the villa. At 28 years old, Byron was fleeing scandal, rumors of an affair with his half-sister, a bitter separation from his wife, and mounting debts that had made England unbearable. He had brought with him his personal physician, a young Italian-English doctor named John Polidori. Staying in a smaller house nearby were Percy Bysshe Shelley, another rising poet, and his lover Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin. Mary was just 18 years old, the daughter of the radical philosopher William Godwin and the feminist writer Mary Wollstonecraft, who had died giving birth to her. Mary had already lived a dramatic life. She had run away with Percy Shelley when she was only 16, scandalizing polite society. Now she was traveling with Percy, their infant son William, and her stepsister Claire Claremont, who had had an affair with Byron in London and was pregnant with his child. They had expected picnics in the Alps, boat rides on the lake, walks through flower-strewn meadows. Instead, they found themselves trapped indoors by the incessant rain and cold. Byron described the weather in a letter to a friend: "We have had lately such stupid mists, fogs, rains, and perpetual density." Mary Shelley would later write of that summer: "It proved a wet, ungenial summer, and incessant rain often confined us for days to the house." To pass the time, the group read poetry, argued about philosophy, and engaged in long conversations by candlelight, conversations that, for a shy 18-year-old girl, were both thrilling and intimidating. Many and long were the conversations between Lord Byron and Shelley, Mary later recalled, to which I was a devout but nearly silent listener. The poets discussed the great questions of the age. Could life be created artificially? Scientists of the era were conducting experiments with electricity, applying electrical current to the muscles of dead frogs and watching them twitch as if alive. Some speculated that electricity might be the secret of life itself; the dead tissue could be reanimated with the right application of current. The theory was called galvanism, after the Italian scientist Luigi Galvani, who had pioneered the research. One evening in mid-June, Byron proposed a challenge. They had been reading Phantasmagoriana, a collection of German ghost stories. Why not, Byron suggested, write their own? Each of them would compose the most frightening tale they could imagine, and they would compare the results. Byron began a vampire story but soon abandoned it. Percy Shelley attempted something based on his childhood but could not sustain his interest. Polidori, the young doctor, started a tale about a skull-headed lady that everyone agreed was rather terrible. Mary struggled to think of anything at all. For days, she had nothing. "Have you thought of a story?" they would ask her each morning, and she would have to confess that she had not. Then, sometime in the early hours of June 16, astronomers would later calculate it was between 2 and 3 in the morning, Mary had a waking dream. "I saw," she wrote, "the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then, on the working of some powerful engine, show signs of life, and stir with an uneasy, half-vital motion." She woke terrified, trying to shake off the vision. But it would not leave her. The next morning, when asked if she had thought of a story, she could finally answer yes. The novel she began that rain-soaked summer would become Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. Mary was 19 when she finished it, 20 when it was published. It would become one of the most influential works of fiction in the English language, spawning countless adaptations and establishing the template for what we now call science fiction. Polidori, the young doctor, also produced something lasting from that summer. Taking inspiration from Byron's abandoned vampire story, he wrote The Vampire, published in 1819. Its villain, Lord Ruthven, bore an unmistakable resemblance to Byron himself: charming, aristocratic, and deadly. The story would influence Bram Stoker's Dracula decades later and establish the romantic vampire as a literary archetype that endures to this day. Byron himself wrote his poem Darkness during that gloomy summer, a vision of a world without light that captured the apocalyptic mood of the season. "I had a dream, which was not all a dream. The bright sun was extinguished, and the stars did wander darkling in the eternal space." The poem describes a dying earth, its sun extinguished, its inhabitants burning everything they can find for warmth before finally succumbing to cold and darkness. It was a nightmare vision born of a nightmare summer, inspired by the dim, haze-filtered light and the endless cold rain that kept the poets trapped indoors. None of them knew that the weather they were experiencing was caused by a volcanic eruption in Indonesia. None of them understood that the sulfuric acid aerosol veil in the stratosphere was filtering the sunlight and cooling the planet. But they felt it, and they transformed their experience into art that would outlast them all. The Villa Diodati summer ended tragically for most of its participants. Polidori committed suicide in 1821, possibly over gambling debts. Percy Shelley drowned in 1822 when his yacht sank in a storm off the coast of Italy. Byron died of illness in 1824 while fighting for Greek independence. Claire Claremont's daughter by Byron, named Allegra, was sent by her father to a convent and died there in 1822 at the age of 5. Mary Shelley lived until 1851, the year of the Great Exhibition in London, a celebration of science and progress that might have seemed unimaginable during that dark summer of 1816. She visited the Villa Diodati again in her later years and fell to melancholy reflection. "I am the companion of the dead," she wrote. "For all were gone, even my young child, storm, and blight, and death, had passed over, and destroyed all. But her hideous progeny, as she called Frankenstein, survived, and thrived." 2 centuries later, it remains one of the most widely read and adapted works of literature in the world, a testament to the strange creative alchemy that transformed a cold, dark summer into enduring art. Who, then, was to blame for 1816, the year the world turned to ice? The question seems absurd when we understand what really happened. A volcano erupted on a remote Indonesian island. Millions of tons of sulfur dioxide rose into the stratosphere. The resulting aerosol veil blocked sunlight and cooled the planet. Crops failed. People starved. Diseases spread. Millions died. No one was to blame. It was an act of nature, a geological event as indifferent to human suffering as an earthquake or a tsunami. Mount Tambora was not angry. It was not punishing humanity for its sins. It was simply doing what volcanoes do, releasing the immense pressures that build up in the Earth's crust. But the people of 1816 did not have this understanding. They searched for explanations in the positions of the planets, in sunspots, in the wrath of God. They looked for someone or something to blame and, in the absence of scientific understanding, they often blamed each other. Refugees were turned away from towns for fear they would spread disease or drive up food prices. Riots broke out at grain markets. The social fabric of communities that had been stable for generations began to fray under the pressure of unexplained catastrophe. Perhaps the real lesson of 1816 is not about blame at all. It is about the fragility of human civilization in the face of natural forces beyond our control. The people of the early 19th century had no warning that Tambora would erupt, no understanding of the connection between volcanic activity and climate, no ability to prepare for or mitigate the disaster that followed. They suffered and died by the hundreds of thousands, and the survivors rebuilt their lives as best they could. 2 centuries later, we understand far more about the Earth system than our ancestors did. We can detect volcanic activity before it becomes catastrophic. We can model the atmospheric effects of large eruptions. We can track the spread of disease and coordinate global responses to pandemics. We have technologies and institutions that the people of 1816 could not have imagined. But we are not invulnerable. The Earth remains a dynamic planet, capable of producing events that could dwarf Tambora's eruption. The Yellowstone supervolcano, for example, has erupted catastrophically 3 times in the past 2 million years, most recently about 640,000 years ago, and will erupt again someday. Such an eruption would make Tambora look like a firecracker. And we face new threats that our ancestors did not, threats of our own making. Climate change, driven by human emissions of greenhouse gases, is altering the Earth's weather patterns in ways that may prove as disruptive as Tambora's volcanic winter. The difference is that climate change is not a single event but an ongoing process, not a sudden catastrophe but a slow-motion transformation of the conditions that make human civilization possible. The story of 1816 is a warning from history. It reminds us that the Earth does not exist for our convenience, that the systems we depend upon for food and shelter and life itself can be disrupted by forces beyond our control. It reminds us that human societies are fragile, that crop failures can topple governments, that famine can spawn disease, that suffering on the other side of the world can ripple outward to affect millions who have never heard of the place where the catastrophe began. But it is also a story of resilience. The farmers of Vermont who replanted their frozen fields. The Baroness de Krudener who sold her jewels to feed the hungry. The Chinese poet Li Yuyan who bore witness to his people's suffering. The young woman named Mary Shelley who transformed a nightmare into literature. All of them, in their different ways, responded to catastrophe with creativity, compassion, and courage. Mount Tambora still stands on the island of Sumbawa, though it is now only 9,354 feet tall, nearly 5,000 feet shorter than it was before the eruption of 1815. The caldera that formed that terrible April night remains, a wound in the earth more than 3 miles wide. The volcano is still active, still capable of erupting again. The aerosol veil that caused the year without a summer dispersed long ago, its sulfuric acid droplets gradually falling out of the atmosphere or washing down in rain. The weather returned to normal. The crops grew again. The survivors rebuilt. But the world had been changed. The westward migration of American farmers, the development of public health institutions in response to cholera, the birth of modern science fiction, the foundations of the Golden Triangle drug trade, all of these can be traced back to that single explosive moment in April 1815, when a volcano on a remote Indonesian island transformed the world. No one was to blame for what happened. But everyone was affected. And that, perhaps, is the most important lesson of all. On this small planet, bound together by atmosphere and ocean, by trade routes and migration patterns, by the very air we breathe, what happens in one place can change everything, everywhere, for everyone. The year 1816 turned the world to ice. But it was not punishment or curse. It was simply the Earth, doing what the Earth does, reminding us that we are small and the forces we inhabit are vast, and that wisdom lies in understanding both our power and our limitations in the face of nature's awesome might.